It was the kind of morning that made you believe the world could still be good. The air above the Sea of Galilee was clean and sharp, carrying the faint mineral smell of fresh water mixed with wild thyme growing between limestone rocks. The hills rolled in soft waves of green and gold, dotted with red anemones that nobody planted and nobody tended, yet bloomed every spring with a faithfulness that put human effort to shame. Fishing boats rocked lazily near the shore below, their worn sails hanging slack, their nets draped across the hulls to dry. From a distance, the sea looked like hammered silver, catching the early sun and scattering it in every direction. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that sneaks up on you quietly, the kind that makes your chest ache without warning. But beauty alone was not what had drawn thousands of people up the winding dirt paths from the villages along the shoreline. Something else had drawn them, someone else. Because in the year we now call the 1st century, this corner of the Roman world was anything but peaceful, and the people who lived here were anything but free. Galilee was occupied territory. Roman soldiers marched its roads. Roman tax collectors sat in their booths, extracting coin from fishermen who had barely enough to feed their own children. The Jewish religious leaders, the Pharisees and scribes, held their own kind of power, not military, but social and spiritual, and they wielded it with an iron grip, piling commandment upon commandment, until ordinary people felt crushed beneath the weight of laws they could never fully keep. The result was a population that felt trapped from every direction, trapped by Rome above them, trapped by religious obligation around them, trapped by poverty and grief and illness beneath them. Into this world, a man from a small northern town called Nazareth had begun to move, and everywhere he went, something shifted. Jesus had spent the earlier part of that morning in Capernaum, a busy fishing town on the northern shore of the lake. But Capernaum had grown loud and pressing. Hands reached for him from every direction. Voices called his name in the narrow streets. People needed healing, answers, miraculous, mercy, all legitimate needs, all real and desperate, but the weight of it was enormous. So he walked. His sandals kicked dust on the narrow path leading upward out of town, and his disciples followed behind him. Peter squinting against the brightness, James and John speaking quietly, Andrew wiping sweat from his brow. The path climbed through terraced fields, past the gnarled trunks of old olive trees, up into the open hillside, where the breeze moved freely and the sky opened wide and impossibly blue above them. Jesus walked until he found the place, a natural shelf in the hillside, a shallow bowl carved by centuries of wind and rain, perfectly shaped so that a voice could carry down its slope to everyone gathered below. The Sea of Galilee shimmered in the distance. He sat down. In that culture, when a rabbi sat, it meant everything. It meant he was about to speak with authority. It meant these words matter. So lean in and listen carefully. The disciples gathered close, and then from the paths below, the people came, at first only a few. A fisherman whose hands were raw from empty nets and sleepless nights, a young mother balancing her smallest child on her hip, 3 more waiting at home. No husband left to help her, since fever took him 2 winters before. An old man with a walking stick, leaning hard into each step. A tax collector everyone recognized, and nobody liked. A beggar, wearing the only robe he owned. They came from fishing villages, from grain fields, from market squares and back alleys. They came because the world had grown impossibly hard, and this man spoke as though God were actually listening. By the time the sun had climbed to its highest point, the hillside was covered. Hundreds sitting on the warm grass, then 1,000, then more. Mothers hushed their babies. Old men leaned forward on their walking sticks. Children sat cross-legged at the front with wide eyes. Not entirely sure what they were watching, but certain it mattered. The wildflowers moved in the breeze around them. Red and yellow and white splashed across the green slope like paint thrown from a careless and generous hand. And Jesus looked out over them. He did not see a crowd. He saw a fisherman's cracked and bleeding knuckles. He saw a widow's eyes that had stopped fully closing since the funeral. He saw a young man with a clenched jaw, holding in years of rage he had nowhere to put. He saw a woman carrying shame like a stone tied around her neck. Certain that everyone in every room knew exactly what she had done. He saw them all. Each one separately. Each one fully. And he loved what he saw. Not the performance. Not the religious costume. The actual person underneath. Then he opened his mouth. And what came next was unlike anything the hillside had ever heard. The scribes quoted other rabbis. The Pharisees argued over the interpretation of the law, slicing every commandment into increasingly fine fragments until faith felt like navigating a legal document. Their voices were sharp and their tone was correction. But Jesus did not sound like them. His voice was steady and unhurried, carrying no anger, no condescension, no performance, just a calm authority that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to something deeper, something in the chest where the real life happens. The crowd had been expecting a sermon about rules. What they received instead was an invitation into a kingdom that operated by completely different logic than anything Rome or Jerusalem had ever offered. A kingdom where poverty of spirit was the doorway to richness, where grief was named holy, where the meek were not the defeated but the ones who would inherit everything. This was not a religious lecture. It was a love letter addressed to every broken person on that hillside. And the first word he spoke set the tone for everything that followed. The first word Jesus spoke that day was not a command. It was not a warning. It was not a correction. It was a declaration. And it landed on the hillside like the first note of a song nobody knew they had been waiting their whole lives to hear. Blessed, in Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke. The word was ashrei, and it carried far more weight than its English translation suggests. It did not simply mean happy in the way a child is happy receiving a gift, a passing brightness quickly forgotten. It meant whole, complete, held in exactly the right place by exactly the right hands. It meant you are not falling. It meant you are seen and you are enough. The crowd leaned forward, because in a world designed to tell them the opposite, that they were not enough, not clean enough, not educated enough, not wealthy enough, not righteous enough. A single word of genuine blessing landed like water on ground that had been dry for years. And then Jesus began to describe exactly who that blessing fell upon. And what he said next turned every assumption they had ever held completely upside down. Near the back of the hillside sat a man named Simon, a potter from a village near Bethsaida. For 30 years he had worked clay. His hands were permanently stained with red dust that never fully washed out from beneath his fingernails. He made bowls, jars, oil lamps, simple and useful things that people purchased without looking at his face. In a world that measured worth by lineage and learning and wealth, Simon was invisible. He could not read Hebrew fluently. He had no standing in the synagogue. He owned no land. He was, by every standard the world offered him, small. When Jesus spoke the first beatitude, the words were so quietly delivered that Simon almost missed them entirely. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Poor in spirit. Simon had heard the word poor attached to his name his entire life. Poor in money, poor in prospects, poor in everything the world called valuable. But Jesus was not talking about poverty as a curse. He was turning it into a door. The ones who arrive before God with empty hands, with nothing to offer and nothing to prove. Those are the ones the kingdom belongs to. Something shifted in Simon's chest. A tightness he had carried so long he no longer noticed it began. Quietly, to Lawson, not far from Simon, sat a woman named Miriam. 3 months earlier, fever had taken her husband in 4 days. One morning he was laughing at the table. By the Sabbath, he was gone. Her neighbors, meaning well, had told her to be strong, to trust the plan of God, to stop weeping and return to her duties. But how could she stop? His sandals still sat beside the door. The bed still held the shape of him. Grief, in first-century Jewish culture, was communally observed. There were structured periods of mourning, rituals of solidarity. But even within those traditions, extended personal grief was seen as a burden to bear quickly and privately. Nobody told Miriam her mourning was holy. Nobody told her it was a sign of love rather than weakness. When Jesus spoke the second beatitude, her breath caught in her throat. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, not cursed, not weak, not forgotten. Blessed, because grief means you loved. And love is the language heaven speaks fluently. A tear slipped down Miriam's cheek. But it did not feel like drowning this time. It felt like being held by hands large enough to hold everything she was carrying without straining. Halfway up the slope, a young man named David sat with his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His jaw set hard. He was 17, strong, and furious in the particular way that young men become furious when the world around them is genuinely unjust. His father had been cheated out of land by a Roman officer with a signature and a smirk. His sister had been mocked publicly in the marketplace. His brother had joined the Zealots, the Jewish resistance movement that believed the only answer to Roman occupation was armed uprising. And David understood exactly why. He wanted to fight. He wanted to make someone pay. When Jesus spoke the third beatitude, David's crossed arms slowly dropped. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Meek. The word scraped against everything David believed. He had always understood meekness as the quality of the defeated, the crushed, the ones who simply gave up. But the way Jesus said it carried a completely different weight. Like a lion that chooses not to roar, not because it cannot, but because it understands something the roaring animal does not. Strength that does not need to announce itself. Power that has nothing to prove. David had spent years believing rage would eventually set him free. What it had actually done was build a prison around him. Bar, bibar. Every time he fed it. What if there was another way entirely? Near the front of the crowd sat a young woman named Leah, daughter of a Pharisee. She had grown up, surrounded by the law. She could recite entire passages of scripture from memory. She fasted twice a week. She tithed to the smallest herb in her garden. She had done everything correctly and completely, but religious correctness and genuine nearness to God, she had discovered, were not the same thing. She was exhausted from the performing and still starving for the real thing. When Jesus spoke the fourth beatitude, something cracked open behind her sternum. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Hunger, thirst, real physical desperation, the kind that wakes you in the night, the kind that makes rational thought impossible until it is met. Jesus was not describing a mild preference for holiness. He was describing a craving, an achah, a need so fundamental that nothing else satisfied it. And he was promising that this kind of holy desperation would be filled, not with a checklist, not with rules performed for an audience, with a feast. Leah's eyes filled with tears. Because, for the first time in her life, her spiritual hunger did not feel like failure. It felt like the beginning of something she had not yet had words for. And now she did. Toward the edge of the crowd sat an older man named Tobias. He had done something he could not undo. Years ago, in a moment of white-hot anger, he had said things to his brother that severed something between them as cleanly and permanently as a blade through rope. Words he meant at the time and regretted every day since. His brother Reuben had not spoken to him in 7 years. Their children had grown up as strangers. Family gatherings had split into 2 separate events on opposite sides of the same village, each pretending the other did not exist. Tobias had told himself it did not matter. He had not struck his brother, had not stolen from him, had not broken any law a court could name. By every external measure, he was a law-abiding man. But the guilt followed him into every room he entered and sat beside him every night. When Jesus spoke the 5th beatitude, the words landed in Tobias's chest like stones dropping into still water, sending ripples he could not stop. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Mercy. The word opened something in him he had kept sealed for years. Because Tobias understood immediately what Jesus was saying, not as theology, but as lived truth. He had been withholding mercy from his brother, damming the river, and the stagnant water had been slowly poisoning everything downstream, including himself. Mercy is not a reservoir you fill and protect. It is a river. It only stays alive when it moves, when it flows through you and outward toward the people who least deserve it and most need it. Just as it flows toward you from God without condition or calculation. Tobias sat very still. In his mind, his brother's face appeared, not the angry face from that last terrible conversation, but the younger face, the boy's face, the brother who had worked beside him in their father's fields when they were children and laughed so hard at nothing that both of them fell into the grain. Maybe, Tobias thought for the first time in 7 years, it was not too late. A young mother named Deborah sat near the back of the crowd with her baby asleep against her chest. His small weight, a comfort she had not earned, she believed, but received anyway. She had made choices she could not reverse, decisions that had consequences she was still living inside. She had asked God for forgiveness more times than she could count, whispered the words in the dark, repeated them in the morning, carried them like a private penance, but the shame had not lifted. It clung to her like oil, invisible to everyone else, but felt constantly on her own skin. She avoided certain streets, kept her eyes down at the market well, wondered always whether the women whispering near the water jars were whispering about her. When Jesus spoke the 6th beatitude, Deborah looked up sharply, as though her name had been called. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Pure in heart. The words should have felt like condemnation. Instead, they felt like an open door. Because Jesus was not describing a perfect heart, a heart without cracks, without history, without the evidence of every bad decision ever made. He was describing an undivided heart, a heart that wants one thing above everything else. Not God's approval as a performance reward, not God's blessing as a transaction, but God himself, his presence, his voice, his face. And the promise attached to that kind of heart was staggering. You will see him, not in some distant future beyond death, but now, in the laughter of the child sleeping on your chest, in the unexpected kindness of a stranger, in the quiet that follows a storm when the air smells clean again and something whispers, I am still here and I still love you. Deborah pulled her baby closer. For the first time in months, she felt something she had almost forgotten the texture of. Clean. An older woman named Judith had spent most of her adult life trying to make peace between people who had decided they preferred their grudges, between her two quarreling sons, between neighboring families divided by a property dispute that had outlasted the original argument by a decade, between members of the synagogue who no longer remembered what the original offense had been but maintained their hostility out of sheer habit. It was exhausting and largely thankless work. Nobody gave Judith credit for the reconciliations she quietly engineered. Nobody noticed the conversations she initiated, the meals she prepared to bring opposing parties to the same table, the careful and generous reframing she offered to each side privately before they met. When Jesus spoke the seventh beatitude, Judith felt something warm settle in her chest, like sunlight through a window. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Not servant, not subjects, children, because peacemaking is not merely a useful social skill. It is the very nature of God himself, enacted in the most costly way imaginable. He looked at the war between heaven and earth, between perfect holiness and irreparable human failure, and said, I will make peace, even if it requires everything I have. And it did. Every person who carries peace into a room full of conflict, who chooses a bridge over a wall, who sits down with the enemy instead of sharpening a weapon, that person is doing what God does. That person looks like his child. Judith smiled. She was tired. Yes, but she was not alone. And she was not unseen. At the very edge of the gathering, a man named Ezra sat with his hands resting open in his lap. The scars on his wrists and across his shoulders were faded now, but still visible in strong light. Marks from a Roman prison. Earned not for any crime, but for refusing to deny the God he served. When Jesus spoke the eighth beatitude, Ezra's scarred hands trembled. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Not abandoned, not cursed, not evidence of a God who had looked away. Blessed, the suffering had not been meaningless. The marks on his body were not defeat. They were the seal of belonging, proof that he had stood for something real when standing cost him everything. And then Jesus added the word that undid the entire crowd. Rejoice, not endure, not survive. Rejoice and be glad when the world turns against you because of me. Not because pain does not hurt, but because pain is genuinely not the final word. The crowd sat in complete silence as the last echo of that command settled across the hillside. They had arrived as the forgotten, the broken, the ones the world consistently passed over without slowing down. And Jesus had looked at every single one of them and called them blessed. After naming the blessed ones, Jesus did not immediately tell them what to do. He told them who they were. This sequencing was not accidental. It was the entire point. Every religious system the crowd had ever encountered began with behavior. Follow these rules. Perform these rituals. Achieve this standard. And then perhaps you will be acceptable. Jesus reversed the order completely. Identity first. Action second. You cannot live rightly from the outside in, forcing behavior to reshape the heart. It only works the other way around. Know who you are, and the living follows naturally. So Jesus looked out over a hillside full of fishermen and widows and tax collectors and beggars and farmers and said two things that must have sounded, to most of them, absolutely impossible. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Not you should aspire to be. Not perhaps one day, if you try hard enough. You are, present tense, already true, unconditional. Among those listening was a woman named Abigail, a merchant's wife of moderate comfort. She kept a clean house, raised her children carefully, attended synagogue without fail. From the outside, her life looked orderly and good. But inside she had been wrestling for months with a hollow feeling she could not name. The sense that her life, for all its correctness, was not actually touching anything that mattered. When Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth," Abigail turned the image over in her mind. Salt in first-century Galilee was not a casual commodity. It was precious enough to be used as currency, rationed in small clay jars, measured out with care. Every household depended on it. A pinch transformed tasteless grain into something worth eating. But more than flavor, salt preserved. In the brutal heat of a Galilean summer, meat spoiled within hours, but rubbed with salt it could last for days. Salt also healed. Abigail had watched her own mother pack salt into an infected wound. The burning, immediate and fierce, but the drawing out of poison, real and necessary. Salt was small, ordinary, easy to overlook in the jar, but remove it from the equation and everything fell apart. Then Jesus added the warning that sharpened the image into something urgent. If salt loses its saltiness, it is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out. And Abigail understood with sudden clarity what had been wrong. She had been living her entire life inside the jar, safe, preserved, separate, protected from risk and mess and genuine contact with the world around her. But salt only works when it touches what it is meant to preserve. Safety, for salt, is uselessness. Nearby sat a baker named Thomas, whose shop occupied a corner of the Capernaum marketplace. Every morning before the first light appeared, he lit his ovens, kneaded dough until his shoulders ached, and filled the street with the smell of warm bread that drew people to his door before they were fully awake. They came for the bread. They rarely noticed him. He was simply the hands that produced it. The face behind the counter they forgot as soon as they stepped back into the street. For 30 years, Thomas had believed his work was invisible in the way that truly ordinary things are invisible. Necessary but not meaningful. Useful but not sacred. When Jesus described salt as the thing that preserved the world at the level of daily life, Thomas looked down at his own flour-stained, burn-scarred hands. Every loaf he baked with genuine care. Every morning he rose in the dark when he could have slept. Every customer he greeted with steadiness when his own life was difficult. He was salt, not in a grand or celebrated way, but in the way that actually mattered most. The quiet, daily, faithful way that holds communities together without anyone writing songs about it. Thomas felt his throat tighten in the manner of a man who has just been seen for the first time in years. Not far from Abigail sat a young man named Nathaniel, who made his living crafting oil lamps, small clay vessels, carefully shaped, their wicks trimmed, their oil measured to burn clean and bright through the long, dark nights. He understood light with the intimate knowledge of someone who worked with it daily. You do not light a lamp and cover it with a bowl. The idea was practically offensive. Why light it at all? You put it on a stand so it can illuminate the entire room. But Nathaniel had spent years doing exactly that with his own life, covering his light. He believed in Jesus, followed his teachings quietly and privately, but kept it to himself because speaking openly meant friction with customers, arguments with family, the social cost of being visibly different in a world that punished difference. When Jesus said, "Let your light shine before others so they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven," Nathaniel felt the comfortable logic of his hiding crumble. Light either shines or it does not exist. There is no middle category. And the purpose of shining, Jesus was careful to say, was never self-promotion. It was not so people would say, "Look at you," but so they would say, "Look at your God." When people encounter genuine light in a human life, they do not wonder about the lamp. They wonder about the source. The most quietly devastating moment of this teaching came through an older woman named Sarah, who sat with her small granddaughter settled in her lap. Sarah had lived her entire life in the back row, never caused trouble, never sought attention, never imagined for a moment that her unremarkable daily faithfulness was visible to anyone who mattered. She cooked meals, tended her garden, said her prayers in the dark, forgave people who never knew they had been forgiven. Nothing the world would record or remember. But as Jesus described a city set on a hill that cannot be hidden, its lamps burning in every window, its light pouring outward into the surrounding darkness, whether the city intended it or not. Sarah felt her granddaughter shift against her and look up with bright, serious eyes. "Grandmother," the girl whispered, "do you think I can be light too?" Sarah's breath caught, because she understood in that instant that this child had been watching her pray over the food, watching her bring bread quietly to the widow on the far end of the street, watching her choose softness when hardness would have been easier. Sarah had thought no one was paying attention, but this little girl had been taking notes. And because of what she had seen in her grandmother's ordinary life, she believed in a God who was kind, present, and worth following. Sarah was not a city, but she was light, and one small flame had changed the entire world of one small child. Jesus was never talking about fame. He was talking about faithfulness, and faithfulness is always noticed by someone. A ripple of unease had been moving through certain corners of the crowd since Jesus began speaking. It was subtle at first. A exchanged glance between two scribes, a Pharisee shifting his weight, an older man mouthing words silently, as though checking what he was hearing against something memorized long ago, because what Jesus was saying carried a dangerous implication. He was reframing everything. The Beatitudes had turned the social order upside down. The salt and light teaching had handed sacred identity to people the religious establishment considered spiritually unqualified. And now the question forming in the minds of the educated and the devout was sharp and unavoidable. Was this man dismantling the Torah? Was he pulling out the foundation stones of everything that had held Jewish life together through centuries of exile, occupation, and persecution? An older scribe named Eli sat near the middle of the crowd with this fear coiled tightly in his chest. He had given his life to the law, copied it by hand in careful columns, taught it in the synagogue every week, built his entire understanding of God around its structure. The law was not merely a religious document to Eli. It was the covenant itself, the living record of God's relationship with his people, the gift given through Moses on Sinai. If Jesus was here to unravel it, then everything Eli had devoted himself to was being swept away. But then Jesus spoke, and the fear in Eli's chest did not deepen. It cracked open into something else entirely. "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Fulfill, not destroy, not replace, not set aside. Fulfill. The way a promise is fulfilled when the thing it pointed toward finally arrives. The way a blueprint is fulfilled when the building it described is finally standing. Eli leaned forward. The smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet was the yod, barely more than a decorative mark, a curved stroke so tiny it could be missed entirely. And Jesus was saying, even that would not disappear. Every word, every promise, every prophecy written across centuries of scripture was still in play. And it was all, somehow, leading here. Beside Eli sat a younger scribe named Benjamin, 23 years old and already exhausted. He had grown up memorizing the 613 commandments of the Torah, the full catalogue of obligations, prohibitions, and requirements that governed every dimension of Jewish life. He knew them all. He could recite them in order, classify them by category, cross-reference them with the commentary traditions of various rabbinical schools. But knowing them and living them were two entirely different experiences. And lately, the gap between those two realities had been widening into something that felt less like a challenge and more like a condemnation. The law told Benjamin with perfect clarity what he should not do. What it never gave him was the power to actually do otherwise. It diagnosed the problem without offering the cure, mapped the destination without providing the means to travel there. When Jesus said, "I have not come to abolish the law but to fulfill it," Benjamin felt something he had not expected: relief. Because fulfill implied completion. It implied arrival. It implied that the long journey the law had been describing was finally reaching its destination. And the destination was not another set of demands, but a person. A young man named Aaron sat nearby, wrestling with a particular statement Jesus had made almost in passing, a statement that had landed on his chest like a stone and had not moved. "Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." Aaron knew the Pharisees. Everyone knew the Pharisees. They were the most visibly righteous people in any room they entered. They fasted twice weekly, tithed on their garden herbs down to the last leaf of mint, washed their hands through elaborate ritual sequences, memorized scripture entire. How could any ordinary person's righteousness surpass theirs? But as Aaron sat with the question, something began to shift. Jesus was not calling for more of the same thing, only more of it. He was pointing at the nature of the thing itself. The law had always carried three distinct purposes, three gifts woven together. It functioned as a mirror, reflecting back with unflinching honesty exactly who you were, not the curated version, not the performance version, but the actual interior person with all its fractures visible. The mirror did not save you, but it showed you clearly that you needed saving. It also functioned as a wall, a protective boundary that restrained evil and made communal life possible. Even people who never thought about God benefited when their neighbors chose not to steal, not to murder, not to bear false witness. And for those who loved God, the law became a lamp, illuminating the path of genuine love, showing in practical terms what honoring God and neighbor actually looked like in the daily decisions of an ordinary life. Near the back of the crowd, a woman named Naomi listened with her hands folded in her lap and tears moving silently down her face. She had broken the law years ago in a way that felt permanent and unreversible, and she had spent every day since living inside the conviction that God's patience with her had a definite boundary she had already crossed. The law, to Naomi, had become purely the mirror function. She looked into it and saw only damage, only the record of what she had done and could not undo. But Jesus was not talking about external performance. He was pressing past behavior into the territory of the heart. The law said, "Do not murder." Jesus would say, "Do not even hate." The law said, "Do not commit adultery." Jesus would say, "Do not even cultivate lust." The law governed what the hands did. Jesus was governing what the heart became. And if righteousness was fundamentally a matter of the heart, then hearts could be changed, Rimadi, given new orientations from the inside out. That possibility, not the possibility of doing better, but of genuinely becoming different, was the first real hope Naomi had felt in years. Somewhere near the center of the crowd sat a man named Nicodemus, a Pharisee of senior standing, who had not come to debate or to catch Jesus in an error. He had come because something in him would not stay quiet, a restlessness beneath all his learning and observance that his considerable expertise in the law had never been able to address. When Jesus spoke about righteousness surpassing that of the Pharisees, Nicodemus felt something crack inside the carefully maintained structure of his self-understanding, because he knew, with the particular honesty of a man alone with himself at 3 in the morning, that his righteousness was a performance, an exterior so well crafted that even he sometimes forgot there was a different person living underneath it. For just a moment, across the crowded hillside, his eyes met those of Jesus, and in that look, without a word exchanged, Nicodemus felt himself seen completely. Past the robes, past the title, past the decades of careful religious construction, seen, and somehow, still regarded with something that could only be described as love. He went home that day, unable to sleep. Within weeks, he would return to Jesus after dark, secretly, with the question that had been burning since this moment on the hillside. How can a man be born again? Because he had finally understood that keeping the law, however perfectly, could not accomplish what he actually needed. Having established that he came not to abolish the law, but to complete it, Jesus did something that left the crowd collectively breathless. He began reinterpreting it, not loosening it, tightening it, not lowering the standard, driving it so much deeper that the standard moved from the surface of behavior into the interior of the heart, which was a far more demanding and far more transforming place to locate it. 6 times over the next stretch of his teaching, Jesus used the same structural phrase, and each repetition landed with increasing force. You have heard it said, but I say to you, not the rabbis have said or the tradition holds, but you have heard. Meaning, this teaching is familiar. You grew up with it. You built your life around it. But I say to you, meaning there is a dimension of this truth you have not yet seen, a depth you have not yet entered. And I am taking you there now. The first contrast targeted something most of the men on that hillside believed, placed them in reasonably good standing before God. A merchant named Judah sat about halfway up the slope. He was a grain trader, mid-40s, successful enough to be comfortable, respectable enough to be greeted by name in the marketplace. He had a wife, 3 children, a house with a courtyard, and a brother named Reuben he had not spoken to in 5 years. The estrangement had begun over their father's inheritance. Judah was the eldest and believed he deserved the larger portion. Reuben disagreed. Words were exchanged that could not be recalled. And one morning Judah simply stopped going to his brother's house and Reuben stopped coming to his pry. Judah told himself regularly that he was blameless. He had not raised his hand, had not stolen anything, had not committed any act a court could name or punish. By the law, as he understood it, he was clean. You have heard it was said, you shall not murder. Jesus began, and Judah nodded internally. Yes, and I have not, but I tell you, anyone who is angry with his brother is subject to judgment. The nod stopped, because Judah was not merely annoyed with Reuben, he was bitter in the deep, settled, almost comfortable way that long-nursed grievance becomes, a bitterness he returned to regularly, turned over in his hands, examined from every angle that confirmed his own righteousness and his brother's fault. Jesus was saying that murder does not begin when the blade is drawn. It begins in the mind. The moment you decide another person is worth less than your pride, the moment you reduce them from a beloved human being to an obstacle, a rival, a problem to be managed from a safe distance. Judah sat with his hands very still in his lap, and for the first time in 5 years, he allowed himself to see his brother's face, not as the enemy who had wronged him, but as the boy who had worked beside him in their father's fields, who had laughed with him and shared everything, who was now living 3 streets away as a stranger. The damage was not only to Reuben. every day of that estrangement. Judah had been killing something in himself as well. The second contrast arrived with a force that made a young man named Asher feel his face burn with heat that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. He was engaged to be married in 3 months to a woman named Rachel, a genuinely good woman, patient and faithful and kind. And he had been telling himself for weeks that the wandering of his mind was harmless. There was another woman in the village whose beauty he had noticed, and noticing had become looking, and looking had become imagining, and imagining had become a private interior world he visited more often than he admitted. He had not acted on any of it. He had not crossed any line the law could identify or punish. You have heard it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." Jesus said, "But I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Already committed. Not if you act on it. Not if the imagination becomes action. Already. In the looking. In the cultivating. In the choosing to return to the thought rather than redirect it. Because adultery does not begin in the bed. It begins in the mind. In the small daily choices about where you let your attention rest and what you let it dwell on and what you allow to grow in the interior space of your imagination. Then Jesus said the sentence that made the entire crowd go still. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. The hillside was absolutely silent for a moment. Gouge it out. Jesus was not speaking literally. Everything else he taught about the body, being made and valued by God, made self-mutilation a contradiction. But he was speaking with a deliberate shock, using the most extreme possible image to communicate a truth that could not be softened without losing its meaning entirely. Sin is not a minor inconvenience to be managed with mild adjustments. It is a devouring thing. It does not stay in the container you assign it. And if something in your life, an app, a route you walk, a relationship, a hobby, is feeding the hunger rather than starving it, the answer is not moderation. The answer is amputation, whatever it costs. Freedom is worth it, because you are worth saving, and sin is genuinely not worth keeping. The third contrast touched something that made a woman named Leah, sitting quietly near the edge of the gathered crowd, go very still, with a stillness that was different from the stillness of peace. She had been married once, 6 months. A brief and unremarkable union that ended the morning. Her husband handed her a certificate of divorce with no explanation beyond the fact that he had grown tired of her. Under the interpretation of Mosaic law that prevailed in many rabbinical schools of the time, a man could divorce his wife for almost any reason he found sufficient. A burnt meal, a personality he had reconsidered, a simple change of preference. And the woman had no recourse and no protection beyond the certificate itself, which freed her legally but destroyed her socially. Leah had done nothing wrong. She was not guilty of infidelity or neglect or any failure the law named. She had simply been discarded. And the law, as commonly practiced, had permitted the discarding without comment. She now lived in her father's house again, carrying the social designation of divorced woman, which in first-century Jewish culture was a permanent diminishment, a mark that followed her into every room and preceded her in every conversation. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. Jesus said, but I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality causes her to become a victim of adultery. Jesus was not primarily issuing a new legal ruling. He was doing something more radical and more tender than that. He was naming what the casual use of divorce actually was. It was not a neutral legal transaction. It was the breaking of a covenant. the shattering of something sacred. And the human being on the receiving end of that shattering was not a footnote in the man's legal paperwork. She was a person. She had been sinned against, and God saw it. Leah closed her eyes. The tears that came were not the tears of grief she had been carrying for 2 years. They were something entirely different. The tears of a woman who had just, for the first time, heard someone in authority say out loud that what happened to her was wrong. The fourth contrast came quietly, almost gently, after the emotional weight of what had preceded it. But it carried its own particular sharpness. A merchant named Tobias sat near the middle of the hillside. He was known throughout the marketplace as a man whose word could be trusted, and he had worked hard to earn that reputation, partly through genuine integrity and partly through a habit of elaborate oath-making that had developed over years of commerce. When Tobias made a significant promise, he swore by heaven, by Jerusalem, by the temple, sometimes by his own life. The swearing had started as emphasis, a way of underlining seriousness, but it had gradually become a substitute for something simpler and more demanding, the kind of consistent daily truthfulness that made oaths unnecessary in the first place. You have heard it was said, "Do not break your oath." Jesus began, "But I tell you, do not swear at all. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." The simplicity of it struck Tobias harder than complexity would have. If you need an elaborate oath to make people believe you, something is already broken. The oath is not the solution, it is the symptom. Evidence that your ordinary speech is not reliable enough to stand on its own. Integrity is not what you invoke in important moments. It is what you build through 10,000 small moments of ordinary truthfulness when nothing significant is at stake and nobody is watching closely enough to notice. The man whose yes means yes and whose no means no has no need of oaths. His entire life is the oath. Tobias sat with that truth for a long moment. He thought about the small adjustments he made to his descriptions of his goods, the slight optimism in his promises about delivery times, the careful omissions that allowed customers to form impressions he knew were not entirely accurate. None of it was dramatic dishonesty. All of it was distance from the simple, clean, costly standard Jesus had just described. The fifth contrast produced the most visceral reaction in the crowd, because it reached into something almost everyone present had felt at some point. The clean, justified, deeply human desire for fairness. An older man named Eli had been wronged publicly and seriously. His business partner of 12 years had embezzled from their shared accounts, denied it when confronted, and walked away from the partnership with money that was not his, while Eli absorbed the financial damage and the social humiliation of being seen as a failed businessman. The law gave Eli clear standing: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The principle of proportional justice, actually a protection in its original context, designed to prevent vengeance from escalating beyond the scale of the original offense. Eli wanted his eye. He had earned it. You have heard it was said, "Eye for eye, tooth for tooth." Jesus said, "But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." Eli's first response was indignation, and it was understandable. But there was a detail in this teaching that most of the crowd would have caught immediately and that transforms its meaning entirely. A slap on the right cheek, delivered by a right-handed person, was a backhanded strike, the specific gesture used in that culture to humiliate a social inferior, to communicate contempt, to diminish. It was not primarily a physical attack. It was a public act of degradation. And Jesus was saying, turn and offer the other cheek. not in passive submission, but in a posture that said, "You do not have the power to define me. Your contempt does not determine my worth. I choose my response, and I refuse to be pulled into the cycle your violence is trying to create." This was not weakness dressed up as virtue. It was the most radical form of strength available, the strength that refuses to let someone else's evil dictate its own behavior. Jesus continued the pattern. If someone sues you for your coat, give them your cloak as well. If a Roman soldier compels you to carry his pack for 1 mile, a legal right Roman soldiers held over Jewish civilians, a daily humiliation of occupied life. Carry it too. The crowd understood this context viscerally. Every Jewish man present had likely experienced the indignity of being conscripted to carry a soldier's equipment. But to voluntarily carry it a 2nd mile was to seize the initiative, to transform an act of coerced subjugation into a free choice, to reclaim agency in a situation designed to strip it away. Eli sat with his jaw tight. Revenge had consumed years of his energy and produced nothing except more bitterness. The cycle had no natural end. Maybe stopping it, even unilaterally, even at personal cost, was not surrender. Maybe it was the only way out. The 6th and final contrast was the one that silenced the hillside most completely, because it asked the thing that felt most genuinely impossible. You have heard it was said, "Love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. A woman named Anna sat near the back, her daughter's hand held firmly in her own. Her former husband had left them both, walked out of their lives without warning or explanation, leaving Anna with a child to raise alone. No financial support, and the particular humiliation of abandonment in a community where everyone knew the details. She had constructed her hatred of him carefully over 2 years, brick by brick, until it felt solid and justified and almost comforting in its consistency. It was the one thing she could control. When Jesus said, "Love your enemies," the immediate response in Anna's chest was refusal. But then he gave the reason, and the reason was not about the enemy at all. "That you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." God's love was not conditional on the recipient's merit. It fell on everyone, the faithful and the faithless, the kind and the cruel, without discrimination and without calculation. And if his children were to resemble him, their love had to carry the same quality, not because the enemy deserved it, because love given freely, without condition, was the only force powerful enough to break the cycle that hatred perpetuated endlessly. Anna did not feel capable of it, but Jesus was not asking her to feel it. He was asking her to choose it, and to begin with something smaller than love, something she might actually manage in this moment. Pray for them. One sentence addressed to God on behalf of the person who had hurt you most. Not because they deserved the prayer, because you deserved the freedom that came from releasing the weight. The sermon's closing line on this section arrived like a deep bell strike. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Not flawless, not without failure. The Greek word was teleios, complete, mature, whole, arrived at the full expression of what you were designed to be. The perfection Jesus described was not the perfection of a performance without error. It was the perfection of love without condition, extended in every direction, toward friend and enemy alike, without keeping score. You were not required to achieve it in a single afternoon on a Galilean hillside. You were simply invited to begin moving toward it, one impossible and grace-sustained choice at a time. There is a particular kind of corruption that targets the best things first. It does not begin with obvious wickedness. It begins with genuine goodness, holy practice, real devotion, and then quietly, almost imperceptibly, it redirects the motivation from God toward the audience. Jesus had watched it happen across the entire landscape of first-century Jewish religious life, and now he addressed it directly, not with anger, but with a kind of careful, surgical precision. "Be careful," he said, "not to practice your righteousness in front of others, to be seen by them." Three practices stood at the center of Jewish devotion: giving to the poor, prayer, and fasting. And all three had developed a performance dimension that had hollowed them from the inside, while leaving the exterior impressively intact. A man named Simeon sat near the middle of the crowd. He was genuinely not a bad man. He cared about the poor in a real way, had grown up poor himself, remembered the particular shame of visible need, and gave generously when he could. But somewhere along the way, the giving had acquired a companion that had become inseparable from it: the need to be seen giving. He timed his donations for full synagogue attendance. He dropped coins into the collection box with a sound that carried. He smiled when heads turned. He had told himself for years that this was harmless, that the giving itself was what mattered, that the motivation was secondary. When Jesus said, "When you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do. They have received their reward in full," Simeon felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not because Jesus was cruel, but because he was accurate. The applause was the reward. The admiration was the reward. And it was all he was going to get, because the transaction was already complete. Performance rendered. Payment received. Account closed. There was nothing left for God to give, because there was nothing left that had been offered to God. The gift had been offered to the audience, and the audience had paid in full with their attention. Simeon sat very still, the warm sun on his face suddenly feeling less comfortable than it had a moment before. And he realized that the emptiness he had been carrying beneath his reputation for generosity was not a mystery. He had been feeding the wrong hunger for years. A woman named Miriam had built a prayer life that was genuinely impressive by every external standard. She knew the required prayers, said them at the required times, stood in visible locations during the communal calls to worship, and her lips moved with the kind of fluency that came from long practice. People noticed. They were meant to notice. Prayer, for Miriam, had become a form of public testimony about her spiritual seriousness, and she had been so absorbed in maintaining the testimony that she had almost forgotten there was supposed to be someone on the other end of the conversation. When Jesus spoke about prayer, the contrast he drew was stark enough to be uncomfortable. When you pray, do not be like the hypocrites who love to pray standing in the synagogues and on street corners to be seen by others. They have received their reward in full. Street corners. The image was not subtle. This was prayer positioned for maximum visibility. Worship as advertisement. Devotion as personal branding. Then Jesus offered the alternative with a simplicity that made it feel almost too small to be significant. When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. A room, a closed door, just you and God. No audience, no performance, no carefully constructed language designed to impress anyone who might be listening. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. The reward was not applause or reputation or the warm glow of public admiration. The reward was him, his presence, his attention, his intimate knowledge of the person behind the closed door who had stopped performing and simply arrived. Miriam sat with the image of that closed room in her mind and felt something she had not anticipated: longing. She had been so busy praying in public that she had never actually gone into the room. That night she would. And the prayer she would offer there would be the most honest one she had ever spoken, stripped of all eloquence and pretension. Just a tired woman saying, "God, I have been performing for so long I am not sure I remember how to simply be with you." And that would be, it turned out, exactly the right place to begin. A young man named Ethan sat near the front, and his fasting practice had developed a particular aesthetic over the years. He fasted twice weekly, as the devout Pharisees did, but he had learned to make it visible through what could reasonably be described as theatrical suffering. A one expression, a deliberate pallor, weak movements that communicated effort and sacrifice without requiring any explanation. People asked if he was well. He said he was fasting. They were impressed. He felt seen. When Jesus addressed fasting, the instruction he gave was almost comically practical in its directness. When you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father, who is unseen. Wash your face, comb your hair, look like a person who had breakfast. Let nobody know except God. Because fasting is not a statement about your spiritual seriousness addressed to the people around you. It is a private reorientation of hunger, a deliberate choice to let physical appetite go unmet, so that the deeper appetite, the one that only God can satisfy, gets room to speak and be heard. Ethan went home that day and did exactly that. He washed his face and combed his hair and smiled at his neighbors and said nothing about his fasting to anyone. And for the first time, the practice felt less like a costume and more like a conversation. Near the back of the crowd sat a woman named Rachel, who had been listening to all of this, with tears moving quietly down her lined face. She was not weeping from guilt or conviction. She was weeping from relief. For decades, she had been giving to the poor without announcement, praying in the small hours of the morning in the corner of her room, fasting privately when her heart felt heavy and she needed clarity. And not once had she made any of it visible, not because she was pursuing some spiritual discipline of hiddenness. It had simply never occurred to her to perform it. She gave because she remembered being hungry. She prayed because she needed God to breathe. She fasted because it opened something in her that ordinary days kept closed. Nobody knew. Nobody saw. Sometimes she had wondered whether any of it mattered at all, whether invisible faithfulness counted for anything in a world that rewarded what it could observe. When Jesus said, "Your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you," Rachel felt the words settle into her chest like something coming home. He saw every quiet gift, every whispered prayer, every private sacrifice made in rooms with closed doors and no audience. He had seen all of it, every single time, without exception. And that, just that, nothing more than that, was enough, more than enough. It was everything. After the teaching on giving, prayer, and fasting, Jesus paused. The crowd had been sitting on the hillside for hours now, and the quality of their attention had shifted from the engaged alertness of people hearing something interesting to something deeper and quieter. The stillness of people who have been genuinely reached, who are no longer processing information, but absorbing something that is reorganizing them from the inside. Into that stillness, Jesus offered a gift, not another warning, not another contrast, not another demand that pressed deeper into the interior life. A gift. He said, "This is how you should pray." And what followed was not a formula to be recited mechanically until the words lost all their edges and became a smooth, comfortable sound, requiring no actual engagement. It was a pattern, an architecture of approach, a way of orienting the whole self toward God that would, if practiced with genuine attention, gradually reshape the person praying it into someone capable of meaning every word. A fisherman named Andrew, not the disciple, but another Andrew, a quiet man from a small village near the shore, had always struggled with prayer in the particular way that inarticulate people struggle with it. He had the words of the traditional Jewish prayers memorized by rote, could produce them on command, but they felt like borrowed clothing. Someone else's language worn over his own silence, his actual interior life, the fears, the gratitude, the desperate needs, the occasional wordless wonder, had no formal channel into speech. He never knew where to begin. When Jesus said, "This is how you should pray," Andrew leaned forward with the attention of a man who has been waiting a long time for exactly this. "Our Father in heaven." The first two words rearranged everything. In Aramaic, the word for father was Abba, the intimate, domestic, daily word that a child used for the man who held them and fed them and knew their face. Not the formal honorific for a distant authority. The word a small child used, running toward open arms. And the possessive was not singular. Not my Father, our Father, when you prayed. You were not a solitary individual petitioning a remote deity. You were a member of a family, a vast and ancient and global family, all addressing the same Father, all held in the same love. None of them alone in the approaching. An older woman named Sarah sat near the back of the crowd, and the word father landed on her with a complicated weight. Her own father had been unpredictable, generous on some days and cutting on others, present in body and absent in every way that mattered emotionally. A man she had learned early to read carefully and approach cautiously, never entirely certain which version of him she would encounter. The word father carried freight for Sarah that it did not carry for everyone, and she suspected she was not alone in that. But Jesus was not describing the fathers they had known. He was describing the Father they had always needed, the one who ran toward you rather than making you earn the approach, whose arms were open before you had finished forming the words of your apology, whose love was not a reward for adequate performance, but the ground everything else stood on. Hallowed be your name, before asking for anything, before bringing the list, before presenting the needs, before explaining the problems that required divine attention. Pause and remember who you are addressing. Holy, set apart, not like anything else in the universe, the creator of everything that exists, who holds galaxies in place with the same attention he gives to a single sparrow falling from a branch. When you remember that, something happens to the posture of the prayer. You stop demanding. You start trusting. Because if this is genuinely who God is, then the problems you were about to describe are not too large for him. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. A young woman named Deborah whispered the words along with Jesus as he spoke them. She had been praying for years for her circumstances to change, for the specific outcomes she had mapped out in careful detail. This job, this relationship, this healing, this resolution by this date in this manner. But Jesus was teaching her to pray a different prayer entirely. Not my kingdom, my agenda, my preferred timeline. Yours. In heaven your will is done with perfect completeness. No resistance, no delay, no friction between what you intend and what occurs. Pray for that reality to break through here, into this life, this family, this impossible situation. It was a dangerous prayer. Deborah understood, because if you meant it, God would answer it, and his kingdom arriving often looked nothing like the arrival you had planned. Give us today our daily bread. After the vast sweep of kingdom and will and heaven, Jesus brought it back down to the ground level of ordinary physical need. Bread. A widow named Esther sat clutching her shawl. 3 children at home with uncertain prospects for tomorrow's meal. And when Jesus said daily bread, she felt the tightness in her chest loosen slightly. Not bread for the year, not a permanent solution to the structural poverty that shaped her daily life. Just today, just enough for today. Because when you ask daily, you remember daily that you need him, that every breath, every bite, every morning you wake to find the world still holding together is an act of grace rather than inevitability. The provision was not always abundance. Sometimes, like the Israelites in the wilderness, the bread was manna, exactly enough, no surplus, trust required for tomorrow. Sometimes, like Job, the provision was simply the strength to endure one more day when the day itself felt impossible. God did not promise to remove every difficulty. He promised to walk through every difficulty beside you, providing what the soul needed even when the circumstances did not improve. Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. A man named Jacob sat very still when the words arrived, because he was holding a debt, a financial one, owed by a neighbor for 2 years, the non-payment of which Jacob had elevated into a moral grievance of considerable proportions. The linkage Jesus was making was not transactional. He was not suggesting that you earned God's forgiveness by dispensing your own. He was describing a spiritual reality. When you truly understand the scale of what you have been forgiven, the full weight of every failure, every cruelty, every small and large betrayal of love, the debt your neighbor owes you looks different, not smaller in itself, but smaller in proportion. Rivers only flow one direction. God's mercy flows toward you and through you toward others. And if you dam it, the stagnation is yours to live in. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. A young man named Daniel bowed his head with the particular relief of someone being given permission to admit weakness. This was not a prayer of spiritual boasting. It was a prayer of honest self-knowledge. I am not strong enough to navigate this alone. Guide me away from the places where I will fail. Protect me from my own worst impulses. Deliver me from the enemy who is more strategic and more patient than I am. And finally, the prayer returned to where it began, with worship. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Not mine, not ours, yours. The prayer ended by releasing every claim to control or credit and placing everything back in the hands it had never actually left. Jesus spoke the prayer, and then it fell over the crowd like rain over dry ground. And the hillside was very quiet, and somewhere in that quiet, something in hundreds of hearts shifted permanently toward home. There was a question underneath everything Jesus had been teaching, a practical question that his listeners had been sitting with since the Beatitudes, and it needed answering before the sermon could close. The question was this: if you cannot serve money, if you cannot hoard and protect yourself, if the entire architecture of worldly security is built on sand, then how do you survive? How do you live without anxiety in a world that is genuinely dangerous, genuinely unpredictable, genuinely capable of taking everything from you without warning? Jesus knew the question was there. He had seen it in the faces before him for hours, and now he addressed it with a tenderness that matched the directness of everything that had preceded it. A farmer named Levi sat on the hillside with the particular stillness of a man who has spent his entire life in motion. He had worked his land from before dawn until after dark for 30 years, expanding his fields whenever he could afford to, storing grain in every spare corner of his property, calculating yields and weather patterns and market prices in the back of his mind at every waking moment. Every harvest he told himself the same thing: just a little more, just one more good season, and then he would have enough. The enough never came. The horizon kept moving. When Jesus said, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth," where moths and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. Levi felt the words land in a place beneath his practical mind, in the deeper place where the real accounting happened. Everything he had spent 30 years accumulating was genuinely fragile. Moths had already worked through his finest stored wool. Rust had already claimed tools he had neglected. His storehouses, however solid they appeared, were made of the same mud brick as every other structure in Galilee. One determined thief, one bad fire, one corrupt official with a legal claim, and decades of work could vanish before morning. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. Levi closed his eyes and tried to locate what that actually meant in the texture of his lived experience. Not gold, not property, not anything with a market value. He thought of the afternoon 3 years ago when he had spent an entire day helping his neighbor rebuild a collapsed roof with no payment offered and none expected. Just two men working in companionable silence and the deep satisfaction of a thing done well for its own sake. He thought of the morning he had told his daughter for the first time, with words rather than assumption, that he was proud of her, and the way her face had opened like a flower receiving the first rain after a long dry season. He thought of the moments of genuine prayer, kneeling in his field at dawn with dew soaking through his clothing, when something that could only be described as presence had settled over him. Those moments did not fill his barns, but they filled something deeper and more essential, a place in his soul that grain could never reach, and moths could not touch them, rust could not corrode them. They were already stored somewhere beyond the reach of every force that threatened everything else he owned. Not far from Levi sat a young woman named Tamar, who had listened to the treasure teaching with the careful attention of someone who recognized herself in it, but from a different angle than Levi. She was not wealthy, and she did not hoard out of ambition. She hoarded out of fear. Every coin saved was a small fortification against the terrifying vulnerability of need. Every purchase delayed was another brick in the wall between herself and the exposure of having nothing. Her frugality was not generosity waiting to be released. It was anxiety wearing the costume of prudence. When Jesus said, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also," Tamar felt the diagnosis land with quiet precision. Her treasure was not money. Her treasure was security, the feeling of control, the illusion that careful management could protect her from the randomness of a world that had already demonstrated its willingness to be cruel. And her heart had followed that treasure into a prison so comfortable she had almost stopped noticing the bars. That evening, as the sun lowered and the sermon continued, Tamar made a choice. Not a dramatic one, not a gesture that would be visible to anyone watching. She would give something away, a specific amount, to a specific person. That would actually cost her something. Not a comfortable donation from surplus, but a genuine relinquishment of something she had been holding for safety. One small step away from the prison. One small step toward the terrifying freedom of trust. The eye teaching came next, and it connected to the treasure teaching in a way that a merchant named Isaac understood immediately. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. Isaac had spent years looking at what other people had, comparing his house to his neighbor's house, his business to his competitor's business, his portion to everyone else's portion. The comparison had produced a steady, low-grade darkness that colored everything he experienced. Gratitude was difficult to sustain. Contentment felt perpetually one acquisition away, and the blessings he genuinely possessed were always slightly shadowed by the blessings he did not. What you focus on shapes everything you see. If the eye is fixed on lack, the whole world looks like scarcity. If the eye is fixed on abundance, Even modest circumstances begin to reveal their genuine richness. Isaac closed his eyes. When he opened them, he made a deliberate choice to look differently. At the wife who had stayed through the difficult years, the children who were healthy, the roof that held against the winter rain, the same life, seen through a different focus, looked entirely different. Then came the statement that made several wealthy members of the crowd shift visibly in their seats. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. A wealthy man named Amos had spent years believing the opposite, that a man of sufficient discipline and genuine religious commitment could hold both loyalties simultaneously, rendering to Caesar and to God in perfectly calibrated proportion. But Jesus was dismantling that comfortable arrangement with the quiet authority of someone describing a law of nature rather than issuing a moral preference. Masters require loyalty. Money, pursued as a master rather than used as a tool, demands your time, your worry, your compromises, your imagination, your sleep, your soul. You can use it without being owned by it, but only if God is genuinely first. Not ceremonially first, not Sabbath first and money first the other 6 days. Actually, practically, daily first. Amos knew which master had been winning. The accounting, done honestly, was not close. Do not worry, Jesus said then, and the two words fell over the crowd like a hand placed gently on a shoulder. A widow named Hannah had 3 children at home and did not know how she would feed them tomorrow. Every night she lay awake with the stone of that uncertainty sitting in her chest. And every morning she rose and managed and survived. But the stone was always there. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Hannah looked up. A sparrow darted past the hillside, dipped, recovered, disappeared into the brush below. Unburdened, she thought about what it would feel like to move through the day like that, not because the need was not real, but because the provision was trusted. Jesus turned their eyes then to the wildflowers scattered across the slope they were sitting on. Red anemones, purple cyclamens, white narcissus nodding in the afternoon breeze. Each one clothing itself in beauty it had not manufactured through effort or anxiety. Not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. Solomon, the richest king Israel had ever produced, draped in the finest linen and embroidered gold, and a wildflower that would be gone in a week was more beautifully dressed because God had clothed it. A young woman named Ruth sat listening, plain and worn, her robe rough and unremarkable. And when Jesus described God clothing the flowers with such extravagant care, something shifted in her chest. If he was that attentive to a flower that lasted a season, how much more attentive was he to her? Made in his image, known by name, loved with a love that preceded her birth and would outlast her death. Ruth looked down at her rough hands and for the first time felt something she had no previous language for. Beautiful, not because of what she wore, but because of who had made her, and who had never, not for a single moment, looked away. After the deep gentleness of the anxiety teaching, after the wildflowers and the sparrows, and the invitation to rest in the provision of a Father who saw every need before it was spoken, Jesus turned the crowd's attention in a direction that required a different kind of courage. Not the courage of trust, but the courage of honest self-examination. Because one of the most persistent and socially acceptable ways human beings avoided looking at themselves was by developing a highly refined ability to look at everyone else. Judgment was not merely a personal failing in first-century Galilee. It was practically a civic institution. The elaborate purity codes of the religious establishment had created a comprehensive taxonomy of who was acceptable and who was not, who was clean and who was unclean, who belonged inside the social and spiritual circle and who belonged outside it. People had grown up learning to classify one another, and the classification came with a moral vocabulary that made it feel like discernment rather than contempt. Jesus addressed it without softening the edges. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. A man named Reuben sat near the middle of the hillside. He had spent years cultivating what he considered discernment, an ability to identify sin and failure in others with what he regarded as remarkable accuracy. He could look at the tax collector in the marketplace and classify him immediately. He could assess the woman at the well by the hour of her arrival and draw reliable conclusions. He could evaluate the quality of a man's faith by the cut of his robe and the precision of his Sabbath observance. When Jesus spoke those words, Reuben felt the ground shift under his comfortable certainty, because the standard he had been applying to others would be applied to him. The measure he had been using, critical, uncharitable, quick to condemn, slow to extend the benefit of any doubt, would be used on his own life, his own failures, his own interior darkness that he had been successfully ignoring by keeping his attention fixed outward. That night, Reuben would lie awake and discover that when he turned the light of his own judgment on himself, the results were considerably less flattering than he had assumed. The mercy he had withheld from others was the mercy he would need desperately for himself. Then Jesus told a story that produced laughter, genuine, surprised, slightly uncomfortable laughter, because it was ridiculous enough to be funny and accurate enough to sting. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? A woman named Abigail sat near the front, and she laughed with the rest of them, and then stopped laughing as the image settled into its full meaning. She was extraordinarily observant of other people's faults, her sister's impatience, her neighbor's gossip, her friend's pride. She noticed these things with the automatic precision of long practice, catalogued them, referenced them in her own internal assessment of the people around her, and occasionally shared her observations with others in the spirit of what she told herself was honest concern. Meanwhile, her own faults, her critical spirit, her tendency to assume the worst interpretation of ambiguous behavior, her satisfaction when someone she had privately judged turned out to have failed in the way she had predicted. These were not things she examined with anything approaching the same rigor. "You hypocrite," Jesus said, and the word landed without cruelty but without softening either. "First, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Not never help your brother, not ignore his faults entirely, but the sequence was everything. First, look at yourself. First, submit to the same honest scrutiny you apply so readily to others. First, do the painful, unglamorous work of your own interior renovation. And then, from that place of genuine humility, genuine self-knowledge, genuine experience of grace, received and needed, then you might be able to help someone else. Not from above, looking down, from beside them, having been in the same darkness and found your way toward light. Abigail sat very still. She had been performing surgery on other people while carrying an untreated wound the size of a plank. A young man named Seth had come to the hillside that morning with a specific grievance burning in his chest. His closest friend had betrayed his confidence, shared something private in a public setting, causing Seth humiliation and genuine damage to his reputation. Seth had rehearsed the confrontation 100 times, had the words precisely prepared, was ready to deliver a thorough and justified accounting of exactly what his friend had done and why it was unforgivable. When Jesus spoke about the plank and the speck, Seth felt the prepared speech begin to dissolve, because he was not innocent. He had betrayed confidences too, smaller ones, perhaps, less damaging ones, but he had done it. He had said things about people that should have stayed unsaid. He had let information slip when holding it would have served the other person better than serving his own need to be interesting in conversation. The confrontation Seth had been preparing was not wrong. His friend had genuinely hurt him, and that deserved honest address. But the posture of the confrontation needed to change entirely. Not from the high ground of righteous injury, but from the level ground of two imperfect people who had both failed each other and both needed grace. Jesus then offered an image that puzzled some listeners and gave others immediate and practical relief. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. An older woman named Leah understood without needing an explanation. She had spent years in the exhausting and ultimately futile project of convincing people who had no interest in being convinced, sharing truth with those who received it only as raw material for mockery, offering her deepest convictions to people who used them as weapons against her. The image was not a call to exclusivity or contempt. Jesus had just spent hours demonstrating the opposite of contempt. It was a call to wisdom. Some people were not ready. Some soil was not yet prepared. And continuing to press what was sacred into unprepared ground was not faithfulness. It was a kind of spiritual compulsion that damaged both the giver and the gift. You could love someone fully and still decline to keep offering what they had demonstrated they would only destroy. Pray for them. Stay present to them, but trust the timing to God rather than trying to force a harvest that only He could bring. The section closed with a sentence so simple it almost hid how demanding it actually was. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets. A merchant named Hosea felt the words cut directly through every rationalization he had built around his business practices. He had been adjusting his scales in small ways, describing his goods with optimism that outpaced accuracy, creating impressions he knew were not quite true without ever technically lying. The Golden Rule dismantled every carefully constructed defense in a single sentence. He would not want to be cheated in small ways. He would not want someone to craft an impression of a transaction that served their interests at his expense. Therefore, the word carried the weight of all the preceding teaching. Therefore, because of everything Jesus had said about the heart, about mercy, about love without condition, therefore, treat others the way you would want to be treated, not the way they had treated you, not the way they deserve to be treated based on your careful assessment of their merit, the way you long to be treated yourself, with generosity, with honesty, with the benefit of the doubt, with the assumption that they were carrying something you could not see. A young woman named Miriam sat near the back of the crowd with tears drying on her cheeks, and she understood the Golden Rule in the way that only someone who had been on the wrong end of judgment could understand it. She had been assessed and classified and found wanting by the community around her for years. When Jesus said, "Treat others the way you want to be treated," she felt two things simultaneously: the comfort of someone finally describing the world she had always wanted to live in, and the quiet conviction that she had not always extended to others the grace she had desperately wanted for herself. Both were true, both mattered, and both pointed in the same direction. The sun had moved significantly across the sky by now, the shadows on the hillside lengthening and softening as the afternoon deepened toward evening. The crowd had not thinned. If anything, the people had drawn imperceptibly closer together as the hours passed. The way people do when something important is happening, and they do not want to miss any of it by sitting at the edges. Jesus had covered enormous ground: the interior life, the hidden motivations, the kingdom economics, the impossible commands about enemies and judgment and treasure. And now he returned to something personal and immediate and deeply practical: prayer. Not the formal architecture of the Lord's Prayer he had given them earlier, but the raw, unpolished, everyday kind of prayer. The kind that happens in the middle of ordinary life when something is desperately needed, and the only honest response is to turn toward God and say so. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. 3 verbs, 3 different postures of approach. Asking implied need acknowledged and expressed. The humility of admitting you do not have what you require and cannot produce it yourself. Seeking implied active engagement. A willingness to participate in the process, rather than simply waiting passively for delivery. Knocking implied persistence. The refusal to walk away from the door just because it had not opened on the first attempt. Together they describe not a transaction but a relationship. The ongoing, daily, unashamed practice of coming to God with the actual contents of your actual life rather than the curated, religiously appropriate version of it. A young mother named Naomi sat on the hillside with exhaustion carved into every line of her face. Her daughter had been ill for weeks, a fever that rose and fell without resolution, a cough that kept the whole household awake, a fragility in the child that frightened Naomi in the particular way that a parent is frightened when they are helpless. She had prayed, she had begged, she had bargained in the dark with a God who had not responded in any way she could identify or verify. When Jesus said, "Ask and it will be given to you," Naomi felt anger rise in her chest before she could suppress it. Because she had asked and nothing had changed. But then Jesus continued, and the 3 verbs began to reveal a different shape than she had initially assumed. Ask, seek, knock. Not ask once and give up when the answer does not arrive on your timeline. Keep asking, keep seeking, keep returning to the door. Not because God needed to be worn down into compliance. Not because persistence was a technique for overcoming divine reluctance. But because the practice of persistent prayer did something to the person praying it. It kept you oriented toward God when circumstances would pull you toward despair. It kept the relationship alive and active, rather than allowing it to atrophy into the formal distance of occasional contact. It kept you honest about what you needed and who you needed it from. Naomi closed her eyes. She had been asking. She would keep asking. Not because she had a guarantee about the outcome, but because the alternative was to face the fear alone. A fisherman named Peter sat listening with the practical skepticism of a man who had spent years working against the unpredictable generosity and withholding of the sea. He had prayed for full nets and gotten empty ones. He had prayed for calm water and gotten storms. He had prayed for safety and watched men he knew drown in weather that showed no interest in his prayers. When Jesus said, "For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks, the door will be opened," Peter wanted to believe it and struggled to reconcile it with the accumulated evidence of his experience. Then Jesus told a story that reframed the entire question in a way Peter could not argue with. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? Peter had 2 sons. He knew exactly what he would give them if they asked for food. Not stones, not snakes. Whatever he had, even when what he had was not much. And when they asked for things that were not good for them, a knife to play with, freedom to wander near the deep water, a sweet when their stomachs were already unsettled, He gave them something better instead. Not because he was rejecting their request, but because he could see further than they could and loved them too much to give them what they wanted when what they wanted would hurt them. If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? Peter sat with that. God was not ignoring his prayers. God was answering them, just not always in the form Peter had specified. Because God could see what Peter could not. And the answer that came from that larger vision was always love. Even when it looked nothing like what had been requested. The empty nets had brought Peter to this hillside. He would not have been here if every prayer for a good catch had been answered immediately and completely. Sometimes the unanswered prayer was itself the answer. An older man named Elias sat near the back of the crowd in the particular stillness of someone who had stopped expecting much. He had prayed with genuine faith for decades, for his son's healing, for his wife's return, for the restoration of things broken by time and choice and circumstances beyond his control. And the accumulation of unanswered prayers had done its slow, erosive work until prayer itself had started to feel like a performance of hope he no longer actually possessed. He had not stopped praying entirely. He still said the words, but the words had become hollow in the way that any repeated action becomes hollow when the heart has quietly withdrawn from it. When Jesus said, "The one who seeks finds," something stirred in Elias that had been dormant for a long time. Not certainty, not the return of easy faith, but something more durable than either of those. The possibility that what he had been experiencing as absence was actually presence in a form he had not learned to recognize. That God had been in the unanswered prayers just as genuinely as in the answered ones. Working in the long, dark stretches between requests rather than only in the moments of visible response. That night, Elias would pray again. Not a confident prayer, not an eloquent one, just, "God, are you there?" And in the silence that followed, he would feel something he could not have described to anyone else. A warmth, a steadiness, a sense of not being alone in the room. Not an answer in words, but presence, real, quiet, unmistakable presence. Near the edge of the crowd stood a young man named Saul, arms crossed, weight shifted back, maintaining the posture of a man who had not quite committed to staying. He had heard everything. He was intelligent enough to recognize the quality of what he was hearing, the coherence of it, the depth, the way each teaching connected to the others with the internal logic of something true rather than something merely clever. But intelligence and surrender were different things. And Saul was not yet ready for surrender. He was too invested in his own plans, his own righteousness, his own carefully constructed understanding of how God worked and what God required. He watched the people around him, the fisherman with tears in his eyes, the widow with hope dawning on her exhausted face, the merchant who looked like a man emerging from a long underwater submersion into air. He felt something move in him at the sight of them, something that resembled longing before he identified it and shut it back down. When the crowd began to disperse, Saul stood, brushed dust from his robe, and walked down the hill without looking back. Years later, on a road to Damascus, in a moment of blinding and total reversal, he would remember this afternoon on the hillside and understand that the seed planted here had not died. It had simply been waiting in ground that needed more time to soften. God was patient with the ones who walked away. The invitation did not expire. The door remained open. Always. For everyone, including those who left without answering. The sun was descending now toward the hills on the western horizon, and the quality of the light had shifted from the direct brightness of midday into something softer and more golden. the kind of late afternoon light that makes everything it touches look simultaneously more beautiful and more temporary. The crowd had been on the hillside for hours. Their legs were stiff, their provisions eaten, their children restless, but nobody left, because something in the atmosphere of that hillside had changed from the atmosphere of ordinary life in a way that nobody wanted to relinquish before they had to. Jesus was moving toward the close of his sermon, and the crowd could feel it, not in a diminishment of intensity, but in the way a piece of music moves toward its final movement, gathering everything that has come before and pressing it toward a resolution. The closing section of the sermon contained three parallel images: two gates, two trees, two builders, and each pair presented the same essential choice from a different angle, pressing the question that the entire sermon had been circling toward. Not merely, "Did you find this interesting?" but, "What will you do with what you have heard?" Enter through the narrow gate. Jesus said, "For wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." A young man named Daniel had been sitting with his arms loosely around his knees, and these words straightened his spine. He had been a follower of crowds his entire life, not in a weak or contemptible way, but in the way that most people are shaped by their environment without ever consciously choosing the direction. He did what the people around him did. He believed approximately what the people around him believed. He valued what the people around him valued. The wide gate was not a dramatic entrance into obvious wickedness. It was simply the path of least resistance, the default trajectory of an unexamined life, moving with the current rather than making any deliberate choice about direction. And Jesus was describing that path with unusual directness. Many enter through it. The fact that many people were walking a road was not evidence that the road led somewhere worth going. History was full of large crowds moving confidently toward outcomes that destroyed them. The narrow gate was different, not because it was secret or exclusive or reserved for a spiritual elite, but because it required intention. You had to look for it. You had to choose it specifically, deliberately, with full awareness that the wide gate was right there and considerably easier to walk through. You had to be willing to walk it, even if fewer people were walking it beside you. Daniel sat with that. He had been waiting for the majority to validate his direction before he committed to it. But Jesus was saying the majority was not a reliable compass. Find the narrow gate. Walk through it, even alone if necessary. The second image arrived, with the practical wisdom of someone who had spent years watching people present themselves as one thing while being another. Watch out for false prophets. Jesus said, "They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them." An older woman named Ruth had been deceived badly enough once to have earned the kind of caution that comes only from genuine experience of its absence. A teacher had come to her village several years earlier. Eloquent, compelling, spiritually sophisticated, using all the right language with all the right tone. He had built a following quickly, and Ruth had been part of it. But over time, things had become visible that his words had initially obscured. The way he treated his family when he believed no one important was watching. The way donations to his ministry flowed toward his own comfort rather than toward those in need. The way he responded to honest questions with defensiveness rather than engagement. His words had been impeccable. His life had told a different story. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. The fruit metaphor was not difficult to apply. You did not need theological training to evaluate it. You simply needed to watch the life over time, not the performances, not the public moments, not the carefully staged interactions, but the ordinary daily unrehearsed living. What did this person's life actually produce? What happened to the people around them? Did they become more loving, more honest, more whole? Or did they become more dependent, more afraid, more confused? The tree told you everything the tree's own words would never tell you. Ruth sat with the image and thought about Jesus himself. The man speaking, she had been watching him, not just listening to him, for months now, and the fruit was unmistakable. He touched the leper, everyone else walked around. He ate with the tax collector, everyone else avoided. He spoke to the woman at the well whom every other respectable teacher would have ignored. The words and the life were the same thing. That was the tree. That was the fruit. Then Jesus delivered the most quietly devastating statement of the entire sermon. And it fell on the crowd with the weight of something that could not be unfiled once heard. Not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, "Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?" Then I will tell them plainly, "I never knew you." A man named Simon sat absolutely still. He had been saying, "Lord, Lord," his entire adult life. He knew the prayers, attended the synagogue, maintained the public profile of a devout man. But his heart, if he was honest in the way that Jesus had been making him increasingly uncomfortable not to be, was elsewhere, busy, distracted, divided between the requirements of religious respectability and the actual desires and priorities that governed his daily choices. Jesus was not saying that action was the replacement for relationship. He was saying that genuine relationship with God produced a life aligned with God's heart. Not as performance, but as natural consequence. A tree does not produce fruit by trying very hard to be fruitful. It produces fruit because of what it is rooted in. And the root was the thing. The root was the knowing. And then came the final image. The one that gathered everything and pressed it into the most concrete and lasting form. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. A builder named Asher understood this with the immediate recognition of professional knowledge. He had built houses in Galilee for 20 years, and he knew exactly what Jesus was describing. Building on rock meant digging. It meant labor that was invisible and unrewarded by any admiring audience because the foundation was underground and nobody saw it. It meant choosing the slow, difficult, unglamorous process of doing the thing properly rather than the fast, easy, impressive process of getting walls up quickly and worrying about the foundation later. The rain came, the streams rose, the winds drove hard against the structure from every direction, and the house on the rock stood, not because it was a particularly remarkable house, not because the builder was exceptionally gifted, because the foundation was sure. The foolish builder had built on sand, and Asher knew what that looked like too. Sand was flat and easy to build on, level without effort, requiring no digging, no labor, no patience. The house rose quickly and looked, from the outside, indistinguishable from any other house, until the rain came, and then it was gone, suddenly and completely, and only the sand remained where the house had been. Jesus did not linger on the collapse. He described it in a single sentence and moved on, because the sermon was not about fear of destruction. It was about the invitation to build wisely, on what lasted, on the words being spoken on this hillside, on the rock that no storm in the history of the world had ever moved. When Jesus finished speaking, nobody moved. The sun had settled onto the rim of the western hills. painting the sky in long horizontal bands of rose and amber and deep gold. And the Sea of Galilee below the hillside had turned from silver to bronze in the fading light, its surface catching the colors of the sky and holding them gently. The air had cooled. The wild flowers on the slope had closed for the evening, their petals folded inward, resting, and the crowd sat in a silence that was entirely different from the silence of people waiting for something to happen. This was the silence of people who had just had something happen to them and needed a moment to let it settle before they trusted themselves to stand. The Gospel of Matthew records the crowd's response in a single sentence. But it is a sentence worth sitting inside for a moment. The crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, and not as their teachers of the law. Amazed. The Greek word was ekpleso, to strike out of one's senses, to be knocked sideways by something you were not prepared for. Not impressed, not interested, not stimulated, struck, because there was something in the quality of Jesus' speaking that was categorically different from anything they had encountered in a synagogue or a scribal school. The teachers of the law quoted other authorities. They cited Rabbi Hillel, Rabbi Shammai, the traditions of the schools, the accumulated weight of rabbinical interpretation. Their authority was borrowed, layered, always referring backward to something else. But Jesus spoke as though the truth he was describing was his own, as though he did not need to borrow authority because he was the source of it. He spoke the way someone speaks when they are not reporting information but revealing reality. And the crowd felt the difference in their bones, even if they lacked the theological vocabulary to name what they were feeling. Slowly, in the fading golden light, people began to rise and gather their belongings and make their way down the hillside. And something was different about the descent. The same path, the same dust, the same distance, back to the same villages and the same lives waiting there. But different people walking it. A fisherman gathered his son close with a hand on the boy's shoulder and held him there as they walked, saying nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and everything had already been said. Something had shifted in the man's chest during the hours on the hillside, a loosening of something he had been carrying clenched for years, a softening around the places where the world had made him hard in the way that difficult work and disappointment, and the slow accumulation of small griefs made men hard. He did not know yet exactly what he would do differently, but he knew something was different in him, and that the difference would find its way into action eventually, the way water finds its way through stone, slowly, persistently, without announcement. A widow who had come up the hill with the stone of grief and financial terror sitting in her chest walked back down with something she would not have been able to fully articulate, but that felt, in the only word available to her, like hope, not the thin, fragile hope that depended on circumstances improving, but something deeper and less conditional, the hope that came from believing someone immensely powerful was paying attention and was not indifferent to her situation. She looked up at the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky above the hills and smiled in the particular way of a person who has received something they did not know they had been waiting for. Somewhere on the path down, a merchant stopped walking for a moment, stood very still, and made a decision. He had account books at home that did not accurately reflect reality. Tomorrow morning, before opening his shop, he would correct them, not because he had been caught, because he could no longer be the person those numbers described. A woman who had sworn in the privacy of her own heart that forgiveness was not possible and would never be offered, found herself halfway down the slope, realizing that the unforgiveness had cost her more than the original injury had, and that she was tired of paying. She did not feel warmth toward the person who had hurt her. She did not feel capable of what Jesus had described, but she felt, for the first time, willing to want it. willing to ask God for the capacity she did not yet possess, which was, she suspected, exactly where all genuine forgiveness began. Jesus watched them go from his place on the hillside. The disciples remained close, talking quietly among themselves, processing the hours in the way that people process something enormous, in fragments, circling back, trying to find the edges of something that did not have obvious edges. Jesus was not watching the crowd with the satisfaction of a successful performance. He was watching them with the specific tenderness of someone who knows what people are carrying and what they are capable of, and loves both with equal completeness. He had given them everything, every truth they needed, every invitation the kingdom extended, every word that the Father had asked him to speak on that hillside on that particular afternoon above the shimmering sea. Now came the building, and it would not happen all at once. It never did. A house built on rock was not constructed in an afternoon. It was built stone by stone, choice by choice, day by day, in the ordinary, unremarkable moments when nobody was watching and no sermon was being preached, and the only thing available was the memory of what had been said on a hillside in Galilee, and the decision, made again and made again and made again, to act on it, rather than simply admiring it. The sermon had lasted hours and covered everything, and in another sense had said one thing from beginning to end in 100 different ways. That one thing was this: God was not what they had been told. He was not a distant lawgiver watching for violations. He was not an exacting creditor tallying debts. He was a father, the Father, the one all their longing had always been pointed toward without knowing his name. And he had been looking for them far longer than they had been looking for him. The kingdom he was describing was not a future reward for present compliance. It was a present reality available to anyone willing to receive it, to the poor in spirit and the mourning, to the merciful and the pure, to the peacemakers and the persecuted, to the fishermen and the widows and the tax collectors and the potters and the bakers and the lamp makers and the women who gave bread to the widow 3 doors down when no one was watching. It was available to everyone on that hillside. It was available to everyone who would ever hear these words in every generation and every language and every circumstance between that afternoon and the end of time. It was available now. It had always been available. The only thing required was the willingness to walk through the narrow gate, to dig down to the rock, to build on what lasted, to let the words become not merely something you had heard, but someone you were slowly, imperfectly, grace-sustainedly becoming. The crowd was gone now. The hillside was quiet. The stars were coming out one by one above the Sea of Galilee. The same stars that had watched over every generation of people who had ever stood on this ground and wondered whether the universe cared about them. And somewhere, in the evening stillness, in the space where the sermon had been, the answer remained. It had always been yes.